Welcome to Snoozecast, the podcast designed to help you fall asleep. Find us on snoozecast.com and follow us on social media and wherever you listen to podcasts. Our current goal is to get to 100 written reviews on the podcast's app to help new listeners find us. If you haven't subscribed and written a review yet, please do. We get closer to our goal every week. Your reviews continue to amaze us, and we learn from your feedback as well. So thank you for taking the time to share. This episode is supported by Eyes Accustomed to Candlelight. Tonight, we'll be reading a story called The Blue Parrot, taken from the Olive Fairy book by Andrew Lang and H.J. Ford, and published in 1907. The story originated from a French book of tales titled Contes de Fées in the late 1700s. Let's get cozy. Close your eyes. Relax your body into the softness of your bed. Now, take a few deep breaths. The Blue Parrot. In a part of Arabia where groves of palms and sweet-scented flowers give the traveler rest after toilsome journeys under burning skies, there reigned a young king whose name was Lino. He had grown up under the wise rule of his father, who had lately died, and though he was only 19, he did not believe, like many young men, that he must change all the laws in order to show how clever he was, but was content with the old ones, which had made the people happy and the country prosperous. There was only one fault that his subjects had to find with him, and that was that he did not seem in any hurry to be married, in spite of the prayers that they frequently offered him. The neighboring kingdom was governed by the Swan Fairy, who had an only daughter, the Princess Hermosa, who was as charming in her way as Lino in his. The Swan Fairy always had an ambassador at the young king's court, and on hearing the grumbles of the citizens that Lino showed no signs of taking a wife, the good man resolved that he would try his hand at matchmaking, for, he said, if there is anyone living who is worthy of the Princess Hermosa, he is to be found here. At any rate, I can but try and bring them together. Now, of course, it was not proper to offer the princess in marriage, and the difficulty was to work upon the unconscious king so as to get the proposal to come from him. But the ambassador was well used to the ways of the court, and after several conversations on the art of painting, which Lino loved, he led the talk to portraits and mentioned carelessly that a particularly fine picture had lately been made of his own princess, though, as for a likeness, he concluded, perhaps it is hardly as good as this small miniature, which was painted a year ago. The king took it and looked at it closely. Ah, he sighed, that must be flattered. It cannot be possible that any woman should be such a miracle of beauty. If you could only see her, answered the ambassador. The king did not reply, but the ambassador was not at all surprised when, the following morning, he was sent for into the royal presence. Since you showed me that picture, began Lino, almost before the door was shut, I have not been able to banish the face of the princess from my thoughts. I have summoned you here to inform you that I am about to send special envoys to the court of the Swan Fairy, asking her daughter in marriage. I cannot, as you will understand, speak for my mistress in so important a matter, replied the ambassador, stroking his beard in order to conceal the satisfaction he felt. But I know that she will certainly be highly gratified at your proposal. If that is so, cried the king, his whole face beaming with joy, then, instead of sending envoys, I will go myself and take you with me. In 3 days my preparations will be made, and we will set out. Unluckily for Lino, he had for his neighbor on the other side a powerful magician named Ismenor, who was king of the Isle of Lions and the father of a hideous daughter, whom he thought the most beautiful creature that ever existed. Riquette, for such was her name, had also fallen in love with the portrait, but it was of King Lino, and she implored her father to give him to her a husband. Ismenor, who considered that no man lived who was worthy of his treasure, was about to send his chief minister to King Lino on this mission, when the news reached him that the king had already started for the court of the Swan Fairy. Riquette was thrown into transports of grief and implored her father to prevent the marriage, which Ismenor promised to do. And calling for an ugly and hum-backed little man named Rabot, he performed some spells which transported them quickly to a rock valley through which the king and his escort were bound to pass. When the tramp of horses was heard, the magician took out an enchanted handkerchief, which rendered invisible anyone who touched it. Giving one end to Rabot and holding the other himself, they walked unseen among the horsemen, but not a trace of Lino was to be found. And this was natural enough, because the king, tired out with the excitement and fatigue of the last few days, had bidden the heavy coaches, laden with presents for the princess, while he rested under the palms with a few of his friends. Here Ismenor beheld them, all sound asleep, and casting a spell which prevented their waking, till he wished them to do so. He stripped the king of all his clothes and dressed him in those of Rabot, whom he touched with his ring, saying, "Take the shape of Lino until you have wedded the daughter of the Swan Fairy." And so great was the magician's power that Rabot positively believed himself to be really the king. When the groom had mounted Lino's horse and had ridden out of sight, Ismenor aroused the king, who stared with astonishment at the dirty garments in which he was dressed. But before he had time to look about him, the magician caught him up in a cloud and carried him off to his daughter. Meantime, Rabot had come up with the others, who never guessed for a moment that he was not their own master. "I am hungry," said he. "Give me something to eat at once." "May it please your majesty," answered the steward, "the tents are not even set up, and it will be at least an hour before your supper is served. We thought—" "Who taught you to think?" interrupted the false king rudely. "You are nothing but a fool. Get me some horse's flesh directly. It is the best meat in the world." The steward could hardly believe his ears. King Lino, the most polite man under the sun, to speak to his faithful servant in such a manner, and to want horse's flesh too? Why, he was so delicate in his appetite that he lived mostly on fruit and cakes. Well, well, there was no knowing what people would come to, and, anyhow, he must obey at once, if he wished to keep his head on his shoulders. Perhaps, after all, it was love which had driven him mad, and, if so, by and by he might come right again. Whatever excuses his old servants might invent for their master, by the time the procession reached the Swan Fairy's capital, there were no more horses left, and they were forced to walk up to the palace on foot. Hiding their surprise as best they could, they begged the king to follow them, dismounting from their own horses, as he, they supposed, preferred to walk. They soon perceived the Swan Fairy and her daughter awaiting them on a low balcony, under which the king stopped. "Madam," he said, "you may be surprised that I have come to ask your daughter's hand in so unceremonious a fashion, but the journey is long, and I was hungry and ate my horse, which is the best meat in the world, and I forced my courtiers to eat theirs also. But for all that, I am a great king, and wish to be your son-in-law. And now that is settled, where is Hermosa?" "Sire," answered the queen, not a little displeased as well as amazed at the king's manner, which was so different from anything she had been led to expect. "You possess my daughter's portrait, and it can have made but little impression on you if you don't recognize her at once." "I don't remember any portrait," replied Rabot, "but perhaps it may be in my pocket after all." And he searched everywhere, while the ladies-in-waiting looked on with astonishment, but of course found nothing. When he had finished, he turned to the princess, who stood there blushing and angry, and said, "If it is you whom I have come to marry, I think you are very beautiful, and I am sure if I had even seen your portrait, I should have remembered it. Let us have the wedding as soon as possible, and, meantime, I should like to go to sleep, for your country is very different from mine, and I can assure you that after walking over stones and sand for days and days, one needs a little rest." And without waiting for a reply, he bade one of the pages conduct him to his room, where he was soon snoring so loud that he could be heard at the other end of the town. As soon as he was out of their sight, the poor princess flung herself into her mother's arms and burst into tears. For 15 days, she had had King Lionel's portrait constantly before her, while the letter from their own ambassador, speaking of the young man's grace and charm, had never left her pocket. True, the portrait was faithful enough, but how could that fair outside contain so rough and rude a soul? Yet this even she might have forgiven, had the king shown any of the signs of love and admiration to which she had been so long accustomed. As for her mother, the poor swan fairy was so bewildered at the extraordinary manners of her new son-in-law that she was almost speechless. Matters were in this state when King Lionel's chamberlain begged for a private audience of Her Majesty, and no sooner were they alone than he told her that he feared that his master had suddenly gone mad, or had fallen under the spell of some magician. "I had been lost in astonishment before," said he, "but now that he has failed to recognize the princess and no longer possess her portrait, which he never would part from for a single instant, my amazement knows no bounds. Perhaps, madam, your fairy gifts may be able to discover the reason of this change in one whose courtesy was the talk of the kingdom." And with a low bow, he took his departure. The queen stood where the chamberlain left her, thinking deeply. Suddenly her face cleared, and going to an old chest, which she kept in a secret room, she drew from it a small mirror. In this mirror she could faithfully reflect whatever she wished. And at this moment she desired, above all things, to behold King Lionel as he really was. Ah, the chamberlain was right. It was not he who was lying on his bed, snoring till the whole palace shook beneath him. No, this was her real son-in-law, the man dressed in dirty clothes and imprisoned in one of Ismenor's strongest towers, and kissing the portrait of Hermosa, which had escaped the wizard's notice, owing to the young king having worn it for better concealment, tied amongst his hair. Calling hastily to her daughter, she bade her also look, and Hermosa had the pleasure of gazing on Lionel, who was behaving exactly as she could have wished. The mirror was still in her hand when the door of the prison opened, and there entered the hideous Riquette, who, from her unpraised eyes seemed to be begging from Lino some favor which he refused to grant. Of course, Hermosa and her mother could not hear their words, but from Riquette's angry face as she left the room, it was not difficult to guess what had happened. But the mirror had more to tell, for it appeared that in fury at her rejection by the king, Riquette had ordered 4 strong men to scourge him till he fainted, which was done in the sight of Hermosa, who in horror dropped the mirror and would have fallen had she not been caught by her mother. "Control yourself, my child," said the fairy. "We have need of all our wits if we are to rescue the king from the power of those wicked people. And first, it is necessary to know who the man that has taken his name and his face really is." Then, picking up the mirror, she wished that she might behold the false lover, and the glass gave back a vision of a dirty, greasy groom, lying, dressed as he was, on her bed of state. So this is the trick Ismenor hoped to play. Well, we will have our revenge, whatever it costs us to get it. Only we must be very careful not to let him guess that he has not deceived us, for his skill in magic is greater than mine, and I shall have to be very prudent. To begin with, I must leave you, and if the false king asks why, then answer that I have to settle some affairs on the borders of my kingdom. Meanwhile, be sure you treat him most politely, and arrange parties to amuse him. If he shows any sign of being suspicious, you can even give him to understand that, on your marriage, I intend to give up the crown to your husband. And now farewell." So saying, the swan fairy waved her hand, and a cloud came down and concealed her, and nobody imagined that the beautiful white cloud that was blown so rapidly across the sky was the chariot that was carrying the swan fairy to the tower of Ismenor. Now the tower was situated in the midst of a forest, so the queen thought that, under the cover of the dark trees, it would be quite easy for her to drop to earth unseen. But the tower was so thoroughly enchanted that the more she tried to reach the ground, the tighter something tried to hold her back. At length, by putting forth all the power she possessed, she managed to descend to the foot of the tower, and there, weak and faint as she was with her exertions, she lost no time in working with spells, and found that she could only overcome Ismenor by means of a stone. But how was she to get this ring? For the magic book told her that Ismenor guarded it night and day among his most precious treasures. However, get it she must, and in the meantime, the first step was to see the royal prisoner himself. So drawing out her tablets, she wrote as follows: "The bird which brings you this letter is the swan fairy, mother of Hermosa, who loves you as much as you love her. And after this assurance, she related the wicked plot of which he had been the victim. Then, quickly changing herself into a swallow, she began to fly around the tower till she discovered the window of Lino's prison. It was so high up that bars seemed needless, especially as 4 soldiers were stationed in the passage outside. Therefore, the fairy was able to enter, and even to hop on his shoulder. But he was so much occupied with gazing at the princess's portrait that it was some time before she could attract his attention. At last, she gently scratched his cheek with the corner of the note, and he looked round with a start. On perceiving the swallow, he knew at once that help had come, and tearing open the letter, he wept with joy on seeing the words it contained, and asked 1,000 questions as to Hermosa, which the swallow was unable to answer, though, by repeated nods, she signed to him to read further. "Must I indeed pretend to wish to marry that horrible Riquette?" he cried. When he had finished, "Can I obtain the stone from the magician?" Accordingly, the next morning, when Riquette paid him her daily visit, he received her much more graciously than usual. The magician's daughter could not contain her delight at this change, and in answer to her expressions of joy, Lino told her that he had had a dream by which he had learned the inconsistency of Hermosa. Also, that a fairy had appeared and informed him that if he wished to break the bonds which bound him to the faithless princess and transfer his affections to the daughter of Ismenor, he must have in his possession for a day and a night a stone from the ring, now in the possession of the magician. This news so enchanted Riquette that she flung her arms around the king's neck and embraced him tenderly, greatly to his disgust, as he would infinitely have preferred the sticks of the soldiers. However, there was no help for it, and he did his best to seem pleased, till Riquette relieved him by announcing that she must lose no time in asking her father and obtaining from him the precious stone. His daughter's request came as a great surprise to Ismenor, whose suspicions were instantly excited. But, think as he would, he could not see any means by which the king, so closely guarded, might have held communication with the Swan Fairy. Still, he would do nothing hastily, and, hiding his dismay, he told Riquette that his only wish was to make her happy, and that as she wished so much for the stone, he would fetch it for her. Then he went to the closet where all his spells were worked, and in a short time he discovered that his enemy, the Swan Fairy, was at that moment inside his palace. "So that is it," he said, smiling grimly. "Well, she shall have a stone by all means, but a stone that will turn everyone who touches it into marble." And placing a small ruby in a box, he he returned to his daughter.